Hello everyone, today we talk about ancient Milan. This video stems actually from the medieval historical regions series that, as you know, as far as the Italian part is concerned, recently has focused mostly on the various Italian communes. I had already made videos about medieval Milan. We just in the many videos about medieval Italy, of course, came across Milanese history at so many different levels. Think about all the time we talk about the Pattaria, for example, the Lombard League, and more, right? And yet, when I was preparing this this video that I knew would have been, in fact, to be broken into parts, that here I will just dilute in the cycle, making at every Italian stage, Italian step of the way, like after the other, not to make like, as you will learn now, 3 videos about the city. I realized that the usual introduction that I make about technically would be late antiquity, but you know, it's easy there to start from the very foundation of the city, was just enough, long enough to make one episode of this. So I haven't quite started to make historical regional series for the ancient world. I made that actually about some Celtic peoples, which is also fascinating as far as the foundation of Milan. That fits also as a city broadly into that discussion that we have quite often in Schwerpunkt on the obvious continuity, and especially for a region like Cisalpine Gaul, later Lombardy, the strong, incredibly strong continuity between the ancient world and the Middle Ages, as far as urban culture, political identity, and also military power is concerned. Right, I have a playlist titled Medieval Cities, and you'll find all these various Italian communes, but also other, medieval European city videos. I have scheduled in for the next days another video about medieval European cities, as a matter of fact, and it's one of those topics that you must approach, in my opinion, effectively only from the history of every city in many ways. So, because otherwise it's too generic, it's too also very often sort of secondary in medieval history books, because the idea is that the city is not what you immediately imagine when you talk Middle Ages. And as a matter of fact, medieval cities were actually larger, more populated, and more advanced in some ways at least, in others than the same ancient one, the Roman ones especially, that are the models of the city, because they are actually all a copy of the eternal urbs, conceptually, and of course, sort of the holy city, the heavenly perfection on earth. And Milan is crucial in this, not just because during the Middle Ages it maintains an incredible continuity with the ancient city, but is also a hallmark of Romanity. And yet also its history dates back to the Celtic era, and the distinctiveness, if you want, of this Cisalpine and eventually Lombard reality is, in fact, the sum of these cultures. The Gallo-Roman culture in northern and also part of central Italy is something very alive. The same name of the city, the etymology of which I think is an interesting introduction for. But bear in mind that this video will be dedicated to ancient Milan is not really it's considered in function to the history of the medieval city that, again, we will see on another occasion, but it's on the list for the Italian section again. And so we will try also to highlight those aspects that serve to this narrative, aside from the history of the city itself, that of course has a lot of archaeology, as you can imagine, but that's not what we're looking at. Also, we will look, of course, at the impressive urban infrastructural might of Milan, that at a point, as you know, was one of the administrative capitals of the empire, that in fact has a very overlooked role we will see it later, during actually Longobards times, that it remains paradoxically in that area that would be called Lombardy, but that would corresponded essentially to the Neustria of the Longobard kingdom. Actually, in fact, the most intense symbol of Romanity in the entire realm. The Longobard kings literally attended, the spectacles and the circus at the hippodrome, just like Roman emperors would do. And paradoxically, that Lombardness is more pertaining to the northeast of Italy. We made multiple videos about that, Friuli, the Battle of the Livenza River. We made a video recently about the 8th century Longobard army that also highlighted this. But the history of Milan, of course, is quite central in medieval Europe, not just because it was practically the largest city in the continent. We think it was really the largest. If the only other contender is Paris, right? Just to give you the dimension of that. But already by the 12th century, it had perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. It were really massive. The entire, the pivot of the Lombard League and of that, not just wealthism, because eventually Milan will become, of course, fiercely Ghibelline in the later Middle Ages, but that sense of power, of might, of wealth, right, described by great chroniclers such as Vezin de la Riva. Again, all these stuff will be seen in another video. Some of you have asked me also about so-called Milanese armor that I plan to make a video on entirely. So it's time that we focus more on this, because again, the only I confess this, that when I was making the Italian Commune series, I mean, especially for the regional, with the regional focus, I was leaving these bigger cities behind, because I would have had to make, again, 3 or 4 videos for each. Like we talk Milan, Florence, Venice. It starts becoming that demanding, as we will see now with this first episode alone. But I understand that perhaps the best way to attract attention also on the other centers. We talk Cremona, for example, it's another Lombard commune. And we will surely widen this, because they were important. Think about Pavia, think about Bergamo, Brescia, Crema, and Monza, Como, more, right? These are all centers that we've seen very often, again, named here and there, but if you imagine having the history of all these communes laid out on Schwerpunkt and being able to move from one another, understanding the complexities, like the nuance, sort of local, regional, and also international picture in which they fit, like it is quite a dream of the channel, like I do for all the other provinces, regions in Europe. I plan to create this tapestry of information across which you can move, right? So Milan is really central as far as that is concerned, and you cannot understand its medieval history without the ancient one, obviously not. So starting from etymologies, right? We know Milan mostly with the Latin name in ancient times, Mediolanum, right? The word from which Milan, Milano in Italian, Milan, as we will see better now in the local language, comes from. And there are different sort of hypotheses. Some are sort of traditional, anecdotal. For example, the idea of medio and planum, meaning in the middle of the plain or middle plain, right? With planum becoming lanum due to the influence of the Celtic language, as we will see now, that literally stems the name of the city still today really owes its existence to, together with other names, other at least pronunciations of certain words, the local phonetics for multiple Lombard words, right? This is important to maintain. There was a dropping of the initial P in the word planum, right? And this is the point. It indicates a Celtic spoken influence. Mediolanum could as well in turn derive from the original Celtic toponym of the city, which is in fact Medhelan, right? It's spelled Medhelan, right? Which also means, in fact, in the middle of the plain, given the position within the Po Valley, at least in its, let's say, northwestern quarter sector, right? But quite a strategic one historically, for which you can consider, of course, Milan being the center of the Po Valley. And in fact, the later Lombardy is, in the Middle Ages, it's a much wider concept geographically and culturally than it is one of the contemporary Italian region, right? And encompassed also other, for example, Emilia, parts of Piedmont, and so on. So, in any case, that will be explained better in the medieval section, right? The other etymology, which is also actually the one I prefer the most, is the place between water courses. So in Celt you have Medhe, Medh, so middle central land or lan, so land, right? And this does make a lot of sense considering the quite thick waterway that, by the way, at the time was much sort of looser and more extensive, given that Lombardy has been heavily canalized, as you know, still in the High Middle Ages. It was actually part of why Milanese, say, Lombard infantries were so tough. It's not just that, but, consider, yes, the Po Valley, a flat land, but it's not quite that. Historically, between all those canals, right, where you can really put up quite intense resistance, even with commoners. And you have multiple rivers, in fact, around. There are the Olona, the Lamber, Seveso. These are all Italian, the contemporary Italian names. Of course, the streams Nirona and Pudiga. There is yet another theory that once Medhelan, so coming from the Celtic, but meaning central sanctuary. So Med, again, is still central. Lanon, however, would be sanctuary. Also fertile land, because Med in Celt can mean fertile, right? And so still land, fertile land. In any case, the original Celtic toponym Medhelan was changed throughout antiquity to Mediolanum, as evidenced by a Celtic language graffiti on a stretch of the same Roman walls of Milan. So this belongs to an era, of course, in which the country had undergone a degree of Italicization. So again, with the Gallo-Italic tongue spoken in modern times. And of course, again, at this point, the Romans had already conquered the entirety of Cisalpine Gauls. It's an advanced time. But what I was talking about before is specifically the sound DH, which, while absent in the modern Milanese dialect, was present in the ancient local language spoken in Milan in the past. And this can still see in ancient Milanese words that were spoken and written as well in medieval times, and also presumably later, such as the word dorada, which means golden, and this is spelled literally A-D-H-A, right? Crudo, right? These are actually words basically in vernacular Italian. Crudo meaning, in this case, actually gruff person. Muda. These have all the DH, right? Muda means change, from change to mutate, literally. Ornada meaning adorned, and all these preserved, right? The sound DH from Celtic times. Also in the local language, the oldest documented name of the city is Miran with the R, interestingly enough. This depends on, I don't want to digress too much on these linguistic issues, but of course, consider that there was a time in which even in a country like Italy that was essentially, passing from Latin to still, in fact, what we call a Romance language, a problem, like in other countries where that was much more pronounced. Think about in English, and also in other Celtic areas. But in this case, this is in fact the point. To a problem how to render the actual words phonetically when they were not Latin words, so what were written in at least official documents, right? And so there was a degree of, like, every writer would sort of resort to a different phonetic system, or better, letters, characters, associations to try to render the name. And this may sound bizarre in the contemporary version, but actually it sounded in a much closer way to also not just the contemporary Italian, but also to the other, to the surrounding languages. In fact, really the myth that Italians would be hopelessly divided, also linguistically, to the point of non-mutual understanding, is a complete myth. Right, at least actually Italy had one of the single highest, if not actually the very highest, level of linguistic integration, especially communication and literacy. It alone would make it anyway, and especially, say, in the Lombard world, but also Tuscany. Yeah, everybody understood each other without much of a problem. That certain idioms could be different in the local, the way they developed it, but the language was the same, right? There is no doubt that Italian culture was something pretty well alive much before the country was unified. In fact, much later, politically. In any case, aside from this, Milan, as you know, is a Mediolanum, right? Is a term you find really throughout all Celtic Europe. There have been dozens of these settlements found, especially in France, so in Gaul. Understandably enough, already at the time, Gaul and northern Italy were very interconnected. We know this name, Mediolanum, would be the Greek version. This was the name given by Hellenic ethnographers to various Medhelan, as a matter of fact, while the Latins would, of course, use Mediolanum, right? But as you understand it, there was a great consonance anyway. And of course, all these Mediolanans share the same etymology. Hence, they highlighted this sanctuary, this center within, fertile land, rivers. Doesn't matter what the etymology actually is linguistically in every case, because that's where mostly the Celtic settlements were established, right, and flourished. So kind of makes the words definitely share similarities. We will talk in some other video. I started a series, in fact, about the Celtic peoples. I made something about the Skordiski. I made another one about the Aedui. So I plan to go on. I wanted to make the Boy next. Some of you also asked me about the Nervi, about something about the Britons as well. I do plan to cover that, time allowing, so we'll proceed by that. And so we'll talk also about the Insubres and the origins of the same line. It sounded very interesting because the Roman historians were pointing out that even before the 5th, 4th century Gallic invasions, right? The one of Brennus that we made a video about, the Battle of the Allia River. There were Proto-Celts in northern Italy. At least these peoples recognized each other, and they weren't surprised about their shared customs. So because, of course, which is also a modern artificial way of saying that, of course, they were practically the same, and it kind of makes a lot of sense, especially if you consider how the Celtic or the Indo-European migrations entirely had occurred. I mean, also the Italics actually had. Again, what I always like to recall is that the Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one, just so they were basically the same people, just differentiating after they had migrated. Aside from this, there is also a question regarding where exactly the original Celtic settlement was erected in Milan, that, as you know, today is much larger. It does have a historical center, and of course that's where you have to search, but it's not entirely clear where. The Roman base is sort of the most obvious, but there may have been other centers that emerged before, as we've seen in other places around, as we've seen in other cities. Now, there are three theories regarding the founding location of Milan that are more plausible than the legendary hypothesis made by Livy, right? And the former are made on the base of the same etymology of Medhelan, and of course extensively on archaeological investigations carried out in recent times in the Milanese territory. So there is an idea regarding the presence of a line of springs, so underground geological layers with different permeability do meet in Milan, and this terrain allows deep waters to spontaneously resurface, right? So it's possible that the city originally was founded, the settlement was founded on a strip of land facing a swamp, right? Which would make, of course, the settlement more defensible from one side. We have, again, the aforementioned Seveso, Lambrun, Pudiga, Nerone, and Olona that are basically surround, right, the city as such. So mostly from the east to the west, and so this channeling that eventually heads towards the Po River that has the other longitudinal course would sort of fit the main. This is especially true for the right bank of the Po Valley, but also in the north. That was to say that the waterways eventually flow towards the south, the southeast, and Milan occupies this space, especially the Ticino and the Olona, right? Medhelan could have been founded also near an important pre-existing Celtic sanctuary that may have been located close to the modern Piazza della Scala. And what we know, however, about the actual founding is the Celtic Insubres tribe carrying that out, as well as the Gola Secca culture already having established, of course, some form of settlement. We are around the beginning of the 6th century BC. This would have happened near some sort of sanctuary, around which eventually the settlement developed further. Naturally, the sanctuaries were quite also associated to the same geological features, hydrographical ones as well, and we can't investigate this further, but all, of course, makes sense considering the advantages that this location could provide. In the 19th century, archaeologists found out that Milan was born on a small village, in principle, it only gradually expanding, right, to a larger settlement. The original Celtic settlement had expanded to a degree that eventually would allow the Romans to overlay and replace it later with probably the foundation of the city. That's where the Romans renamed the settlement, as attested by Livy, as Mediolanum, right? So respecting part what was actually the name, the Celtic name, just the Latinized version. And the Roman city was, of course, in turn gradually overlaid and replaced by the medieval one, right? Because, again, the expansion, of course, by far exceeded the Roman one, given this was a real medieval metropolis, and as we explained before, this is also normal. We've seen it in many other Italian communes that during the 12th, 13th, the 14th century, there were even up to 3-4 city rings, right? eventually created it, only the original one being the one of Roman foundation. So that gives you an idea probably of the demographic expansion in comparison. So it's clear, like in this other dynamics, also considering the size of the settlement, that the urban center of Milan has therefore constantly grown concentrically, right, up to modern times around the first Celtic nucleus, right. And Milan really has an enormous hinterland, as in also outside the city, the urban space proper, but the enormity of the center brought many different foundations, many monastic centers, many abbeys all around. And aside from the heavy industrialization that took place in the 19th and the 20th century, this area was very productive, all well in ancient, as even more in medieval times. In modern times, there were important industries, again, armor, glass work, during the Spanish domination, whereas really this was a powerhouse of Western European economy for till to this day, telling the truth. So in the 5th century BC, what had happened regarding also the Celtic expansion was the decline in the Golasecan centers located along the Ticino River, and this probably occurred in the same moment in which, in fact, the Celtic insubrian Medhelan developed, right? This established a new trade network, or at least the Gauls took over the pre-existing settlements and in the area and sort of boosted further this locality. And the distribution map of findings from the early Iron Age shows that the Golasecan settlement of Medhelan, that still was there in the 5th century BC, covered an area of about 12 hectares near the modern Piazza della Scala. And so when the Celts invaded from Gaul and the Boianum in the 4th century BC, this had happened again at different waves also earlier. So when you look at the Golasecans, there is still some actual Celtic pinch in there. That's why this sounds chronologically overlapping, but that's the point. In any case, that was the major migration, and it conventionally marked the transition from the early to the late Iron Age in northern Italy. And unlike other populations of the region, however, the Insubrians were able to resist the initial political competition, other invasions, and so maintaining their identity as a people before the Roman conquest. And they were, in fact, the most important, at least. Milan was already in, again, this northwestern sector of the Po Valley, definitely the most important center, again, on which the Insubrians had based themselves. So Livy, which eventually is followed in the Middle Ages by the famous Milanese chronicler Bonvesin de la Riva, states that Milan was founded proper in the 6th century BC. And his version basically sticks to some religious meaning, right? That there was a semi-haired soul found there. And the Celtic tribe led by Bellovesus, who had defeated the Etruscans that were present in the Po Valley as the dominating force up to that point, emerging victorious in the Battle of the Ticino River, would have fundamentally established Milan. There are different legends, actually. One reported by the famous Renaissance historian and Milanese Bernardino Corio, in fact, in his History of Milan, that attributes it to Cato, right? Milan would have been founded by, and this is ridiculous actually, Medo and Olano, right? Two Etruscan commanders during the expansion of the civilization in so-called Padanian Etruria, but this has nothing really to do with it. Corio was very sensitive, like it was normal at the time with classicistic explanations, and this just made up in many ways. Cario's work, however, is very interesting because it's based on earlier sources, because mostly talks about medieval Milan, late medieval Milan, and the guy knew certain chronicles of the 13th and 14th century that we do not have for the history of Milan, that unfortunately is pretty scanty because of the archives that were destroyed later on in Milanese history. And and we know from him, in fact, some reliable information that we understand coming from these other chronicles now lost. And so this is just an exception of, again, a humanistic eccentricism. In reality, Milan developed after rather the victorious struggles of the Celts against other populations. Yes, also the Etruscans, but there were the Ligurians, the Taurini, after which Turin comes from, by the way. So we're talking about western, southwestern neighbors. And also, again, in central Po Valley, the Etruscans, they surely were there, and the Celts did overwhelm. Pliny the Elder, in his natural history, generically attributes the foundation of Milan to the Celts, but he doesn't offer further details. Archaeologically, we know that the Celtic settlement was established, of course, with this also military function of some sort. It was an oppidum, as the Latins called it, and it was supposed to have the same location and extension as the Golasecan settlement. Thus, it of course was older. And of course, here we do not go back in prehistory. Of course, there were lots of people inhabiting that before from quite a long time. We just made recently a video about the foundation of Rome that illustrated at least as a, at the end, from the Torre Spaccata finds, of course, how the Romans, even though of course Rome was yet to come conceptual, of 5000 BC, late Stone Age lead at the time. But what you have here is essentially a more gentrified, civil, agricultural community that is taken over, as it would happen for the Celts themselves when the Germans arrived in Central Europe, by a much more brutal, militarized, and in fact, much more aggressive community. You can imagine, again, this taking really the form of different waves of different, early infiltration. We've seen it many times. Just think about the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain, first as mercenaries, then bringing the communities, and so on. And so, of course, these areas were very much in contact with one another. Think about the Etruscans that were pretty much in contact with Scandinavia. They even probably contributed to develop the futhark and the script and the. So these were peoples who knew each other pretty well already. And again, the Indo-European migrations had already happened in Italy from quite over half of a millennium at the latest. All right, so this wasn't really surprising anyone, but there were other waves, and this was again at the time the most important, this major Celtic one, after which we see mostly the political map, like the Insubris, the Boyd, and so on. There was also just a process of cultural Celticization of peoples that remained fundamentally, of course, what they were before, right? But it's important because still Milan becomes more of a strategic center, an oppidum, and we see, in fact, extensive works after the Celtic invasion, made of wood and earth, that albeit being scantily documented, were essentially what would be understood by Polybius and Strabo as, at least in their view, as village of some sort, but it was something bulkier, and especially again emerging from a more militarized context, and the Romans in fact sort of had it clearer, also because they got there in greater, with greater touch to the reality, the ground reality. So after being the most important settlement of the Insubrian Celts that naturally had different settlements in the region, Milan was occupied in 222 BC, following a fierce siege by the Roman consuls Cneius Cornelius Scipio Calvus and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. This was the first Roman occupation. Then you know what happens during the Second Punic War. The Carthaginians arrive, crossing the Western Alps, and essentially the Romans were expelled from the area. Hannibal allied with the local Celts that weren't really particularly aggressive in that context, but they were supporting at least the Carthaginians in their efforts against Rome. And it was thus only in the early years of the 2nd century BC, at the end of the Second Punic War, the Roman victory. So these are the years 196 or 194. At the Insubrians, as well as the boy, that named Bologna, right? And we still have to do that. It would be interesting to make a video about medieval Bologna, say university city in itself, but the actual, but very active, also military activity of the city. That this center submitted to Roman domination for good. Right, little is known about Celtic Milan, as you have understood, but even less about the early Roman one. The Pompeius Strabo law, the Lex Pompeia de Gallia Citerior of 89 BC, conferred the dignity of a Latin colony to Mediolanum. Right, this was an important step because it extended some important citizenship level, and especially with the economical bonuses that came with that. The Cisalpine Gaul would in fact be conferred, as we will see now, in the Civitas Optimo Iure, and also aggregated to Italy as a whole. Right, it's a momentous step in the history of the region. We are in the late Republic, right? And the Milanese notables at that point disapproved of the declaration of the Po Valley as a simple province, though, the Gallia Cisalpina, right? So they supported the attempt of the consul Lepidus to overthrow the heirs of the Sulan faction. This was actually part of a bigger struggle. I mean, Milan was just following what the broader Roman dynamic really was. In fact, this attempt even failed, and in 77 BC the rebellion was crushed with a massacre, by the way. In any case, the strategic importance of Cisalpine Gaul, and especially its manpower, right, would become crucial in Roman history. Essentially, if you wanted to control the Roman Empire during Caesar Pompey's civil war, you had to control Cisalpine Gaul. This is where essentially the majority, the best troops came from. These were people who were not yet gentrified, were Romans mixed with Celts. They controlled quite important routes, again, between Gaul, Italy, Illyricum, and so on. And they had this pretty strong mix. That Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were fueled by recruits in this area, right? From 58 BC to 50 BC, in fact, Milan acquires the status of the most important center of Cisalpine Gaul, also because of Caesar's, again, basing needs. And as we've seen, it was also developing economically after it had been recognized as a Latin colony. So much so that in 49 BC, Milan was elevated to the status of a municipium within the Lex Roscia. And after Caesar's death, the city followed actually Caesar's assassins, not much because of hatred towards Caesar in particular way. This was actually a contingent political choice that we can't digress on it. The important thing is that Octavian granted clemency to Mediolanum, which was also developing in the proper Roman urban way, right? There was a new city center focusing around the Forum that essentially moved a few hundred meters away from the Celtic one. So, of course, we understand these things loosely, but it's still relevant because the Romans, of course, yes, they built their cities, of course, where the previous settlements of other peoples really were, but of course they improved it and they expanded it further to a degree of infrastructural complexity that, of course, modified what was the same topography of the settlement. The Celtic market was located where, again, Piazza della Scala is now, while the Roman one was located near the modern Piazza San Sepolcro. Since this center had been, after all, frontier colony up to a few generations ago, it had evolved as a city, as many other, of course, Roman controlled and refounded centers, from the original Roman castrum, that is, the military camp, which, as you know, followed always the same plan, and that had, of course, been, like, there were places that the Romans had conquered without refounding a proper city, right? This one was important enough, and especially strategically located in such a way that the foundation was necessary. And the Romans had, however, shifted, also in this case, the location of the castrum, of the fortified settlement, which was located just west of the Celtic settlement of Medhelan. So they shifted the center as well. So in Imperial times, the importance of Milan increased, right? Milan was headed to become one of the most important cities of the empire. We'll see it better. It definitely was historically, like in Justinian's times, Milan was one of the largest cities in the empire by surface and population. In fact, the more still in, say, so-called Byzantine times, actually the largest cities of the empire were located in Italy, with Constantinople in the east sort of already starting to absorb all the others in size. Constantinople was just slightly larger than Rome, extensionally speaking. And as you know, Milan, in fact, would become even more important than Rome, administratively at least, in the later Roman Empire. Also for still strategic needs. I mean, the importance of Milan, just as you see during the wars against Frederick Barbarossa and in any other, context, that involved the Po Valley, etc., of course, was the center, like, it connected, again, France with northern Italy and further, in the east, the north, the south, so a crossroad that you can't really do without, especially considering that it's also located in a fertile region. It has industries, and it's still in many ways also even more important than Rome, under certain points of view, at least in the contemporary Italian Republic. At least the financial center, like the Italian stock exchanges in Milan, right, with the other, Frankfurt instead of Berlin, etc. You always have this kind of, depending on, the paths of history, right? In any case, Milan was also more exposed. And that's why also it was more strategically important to the potential attacks from the north, right? And we don't talk just about the late Roman times, but broadly speaking, the Celtic area was yet to be pacified until late, essentially at the end of the 1st century, the BC, the beginning of the 1st AD. so the area was still relative. I mean, in Italy not really, but across the Alps, relatively unstable. You would have also, this will be more evident in late Roman times, in spite of well before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there had been incursions within this. I mean, northern Italy, and the same Romans had been fighting against one another, quite happily having to seize this control of this still, again, very relevant northern part of the peninsula. It was actually less developed. Like in antiquity, of course, central and southern Italy were more economically developed than the Po Valley. It was sort of never really connected to the Mediterranean traffics, right? Central Italy was much better connected to Provence, the Provincia, in fact, as the Romans called it, because it was a much more heavily Romanized area. Of course, Milan was heavily Romanized by European standards, but comparatively, it was just a bit more of a military area than the rest. In any case, it, again, does develop as a Roman metropolis. It's registered in the Uffentina tribe, tribus. It was awarded the title of Imperial colony in the 2nd century AD, while in the 3rd, and here we are, recurring barbarian invasions actually conferred her greater importance as a defense outpost, all right, in an area from which the imperial court that could move there could control better the situation. It's not a coincidence that following a major battle fought near the Milanese walls in 260, the Emperor Gallienus managed to repel a horde of a lot of Alemanni. The sources say 300,000, but actually it was just 1/10 of that at the most. And yeah, the Alemanni are just north, right? Historically, I made multiple videos about the Alemanni, Alemannia, Alpine Reich, etc., and we've seen it just during, again, if you look at the time of the Lombard League, Lombardy in the north borders with Swabia. Como actually is part of the Swabian honor. It was called by the local nobility, and I made a video about this, the one from Dutch to Dukedom for Lotharingia Swabia. So it's just that close across the Alps, and Milan is just, again, at the bottom of the valleys that come from this direction. The Alemanni naturally were, I mean, they would tour around, but more preferably they would invade, in fact, from that northwestern direction, right? And on the aforementioned occasion, the same Emperor Gallienus opened a mint in Milan, which was the first time, still documenting, again, the enormous prestige of this city, because, as you know, the mint was connected with very specific civic authority, the availability of precious metal, the necessity, again, of emperors to essentially rule from there, and so issuing their edicts, having their financial policy in order, right? In fact, some of the pictures I uploaded here come fortunately from the beautiful mint of Milan with all these numismatic value, right, for late antiquity and more, right? Aurelian, the Restitutor Orbis, during, in fact, his reordering of the Roman provinces, made Mediolanum the capital of the region Emilia et Liguria, or Aemilia if you prefer, still in the classical way. Times were changing, but Romance was sort of kicking in a smoother way. And the seat as well of an imperial officer tasked with overseeing the Western theater, like the Western provinces, right? Whereas the let's say Aquileia, we've seen in the video about Friuli, was instead more deputy to scope the direction of course, the Illyricum, a wholly different world, starting to be, well, not too much. Again, those areas were even Latinized, much more than we usually think. The Danube Valley was actually under Latin influence than Greek one, but still, again, there are the steppes, there are people settling there. The situation starts to become hot, at least in the later centuries in particular. But the Goths were already bordering, like on the frontier. That's the point. We have seen in 268 Milan having been besieged by Gallienus during the war against the usurpers Aurelius. The Germans, after the first time had happened with the Alemanni, but once again threatened Milan and were defeated again by Claudius Gothicus, right? A name, a warranty you would imagine. Thus, Mediolanum acquired even a greater importance, and historically it would gain an impressive amount of infrastructure over the previous centuries. For example, it had a very large amphitheater that made it the third largest in the empire after the one of Rome, so the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, and the one of Capua. So think about this, because it's how relevant, again, this northern center really was. Its center, by the way, its settlement had expanded well beyond the Roman walls built by Augustus back in the day. So you realize a potential increasing late Roman times. This is something that opens to the early Middle Ages, when things get rebalanced in the Italian peninsula, and the north actually starts being from Longobards, Carolingian times, actually the most developed region in Europe, together with northern France, right? At least in the west. So when Diocletian, I made a video about him just a couple of months ago, decided to divide the empire in, well, technically 4, but it was in 2, at least for the alternation of the Caesars and the Augusti. He chose the east for himself, albeit being sort of close still to Western affairs. And he granted instead Mediolanum as the residence of his colleague Maximin, making effectively the city the administrative capital of the Western Roman Empire. Right? I stress administrative because even when we say but Milan, Ravenna, etc. became capitals, yes, but nowhere in Roman history everybody thought that Rome was not the capital of the empire, right? Not in terms of wishful thinking. These people literally believed that Rome was the sacred center of the world, and that there could be nothing you could do to change that. This continued throughout the entire Middle Ages, and that's how powerful it was at the beginning. You can imagine. But this is a moment of pride of Milan, because there are these ceremonies celebrated by Diocletian and Maximian, who entered the city triumphantly on a chariot, actually on a carriage, and Diocletian, that was the boss, reserved the title of Jovius for himself, while attributing to Maximian the one of Hercules. So Jupiter, Hercules, this is like the pair again. Jupiter, Mars, if you really want to stick at least. I made just in that video about the foundation of Rome, that conception in the most archaic Roman sense of what Mars really was, not the Ares, the dumb brother of Athena, right? But something more similar to Tyr, like for in the Germano-Norse religion. I made multiple videos about this topic, so history of religions, if you're interested in. So it's relevant that Milan again was the center of this display of power, and the city bears topographically the mark of this, because 2 city gates belonging to Milan's Roman walls were named after this, right? You have the Jovian and the Herculean Gate, right, after Diocletian and Maximian, respectively, right? In 200, we're talking the Roman walls, right? Then, of course, were the medieval ones that are another thing. But in 286, Maximian had a second ring of walls. So we're talking about 4.5 kilometers long, built, and this extended especially to the northeast of the original Augustan fortifications. There was a moat on the outside of this ring. Then at a certain distance you had the gates. They were equipped with towers. There's a typical late Roman, structures. Think about just the Aurelian walls in Rome and something similar. They had a bridge in the front, crossing the watercourse. So you see that, of course, the strategic relevance of the waterways around Milan was maintained. Was all this complex hydraulic engineering behind this, and again, Milan would exploit that remarkably, especially in the Middle Ages. And at least the path of the ancient Roman moat still exists today. Can be seen. There are parts here. I posted some of the towers of the. You see, in fact, in front of the walls that survive in some section. In front of that, still the moat that was established in late antiquity. In addition, Maximian embellished the city with various monuments. There are the Herculean baths, for example, so a large circus that is the one that remains. We were talking about before, was very enjoyed by the Goths and the Longobards, that again were absolutely fixated with the maintenance of this. Like, it's a complete myth again. I made an entire video dedicated to this for the Longobards. That for the Ostrogoths it's even truer. But that in spite of the decline, especially after the Gothic War, the Longobards weren't seeking at all to eliminate Romanity. They needed actually to make it stand, and they created a hell of a kingdom, still on a Germanic footprint institutionally, identically, but of course heavily Romanized and issuing in Latin and more. And again, their customs, the centrality of the Longobard kingdom later around Milan, Pavia, because they were both actually that important in Monza, is something that goes on with the Italic kingdom from Carolingian times onwards. It's always this triangle, basically, that remains the one of the Italic crowning that was necessary, of course, differently from the one of the crowns of the other post-Carolingian kingdoms, to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome by the papacy. If you didn't have this, if you didn't pass from these cities, you couldn't really become a Roman emperor. So we have, there's trace vestige. Again, I can't quite digress on these topics because archaeologically speaking they're very complex, but to make the long story short, one of the two towers, part of the circus gates, where essentially the chariots started to race, where it started to run from, was transformed into a bell tower, and this still exists today. It's the bell tower of the Church of St. Maurice of the major monastery. And just, think about that. Of course, there were restructurations involved to an important extent, but they are still the same structures, right? And Milan, as we will see, did undergo severe destructions, but it, of course, still continued as a city, and again as just a quite vibrant and active one by any Western standard and beyond. Now, Maximian built his own mausoleum in Milan, right, which is the same thing that Diocletian did in Split, interestingly enough. So this was truly the Western capital. Also in this case, you have the remains of this mausoleum incorporated in the monastery of Saint Victor to the body, and Maximian porphyry Egyptian sarcophagus, after various turned, let's say, is still preserved today at the baptistery of the Cathedral of Milan. Admittedly, not much has remained of the broader buildings, right? We have few traces, such as the columns of St. Lawrence, which come from Roman buildings dating at least to the 2nd or 3rd century. Probably this was a pagan temple. And they were transported to the current location to complete the emerging Basilica of St. Lawrence. So you have also this is true also in Rome. There are some facades of beautiful Roman churches of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, that are literally done with the same marble of the Colosseum. And if you want to see what the Colosseum looked like, you just look at the facade of those churches, because it's very well, like, all laid out, homogeneous. And so they needed eventually that construction material. Let's say that the sense that you would leave the ancient structures as they were is a concept that emerged pretty just around the Renaissance, where the most enlightened figures began to understand the value of preservation of this historical legacy. But you got to understand the medievals too, because of course, if you were under severe pressure, well, these things would do, but it was also just a habit to say, okay, well, let's use those. It's just even a pagan temple. Let's build a basilica with that. We do have a lot of evidence of the precocious Milanese predisposition for labor, craftsmanship, mercantile activities that would mark the history of the city, especially from the Middle Ages onwards. And again, that's where you see the continuity with the past in many ways. There are numerous marble inscriptions that testify this. Ausonius, in his work Ordo Urbium Nobilium 7, describes Mediolanum around the 80s, the 90s of the 4th century AD. It says, in Mediolanum, everything is worthy of admiration. There is great wealth and many noble houses. The population is of great capacity, eloquence, and affability. The city has expanded and is surrounded by a double circle of walls. There are the circus, where the people enjoy shows, the theater with the wedge-shaped seating, the temples, the fortress of the Imperial Palace, the Mint, the district named after the Herculean baths. The colonnaded courtyards are adorned with marble statues. The walls are surrounded by a fortified embankment. Its constructions are more magnificent than the other, as if they were rivals, and their grandeur is not diminished, even by the proximity to Rome. This is quite important. Again, the sense that Milan was a sort of altar capital of some sort was present at the time. Maximian and Diocletian abdicated on the same day, in 306. There was, after this, a series of succession wars, as you know, following the disgregation of the tetrarchic system. This lasted years. You have Severus preparing the expedition against Maxentius. Maxentius himself fighting against Constantine, and the latter finally victorious over Maxentius in Rome. In 292, Diocletian had made Milan the residence of the prefect of the Praetorian Guard and the vicar of Italy. So it tells you again how much relevance, even for the aforementioned contendants, Milan really had. Meanwhile, in the history of the city and in Europe, things were changing, as you know, at a spiritual level, in ways that they are not just anecdotal, that I always propose myself to make so many different videos, because it's easy to say Christianity spread, right? And treating this as the history of, first it was paganism, and then this other thing came around. We do not really understand why it sort of kind of was different, but, these people kind of believe different things, but at a certain point they could switch the stuff. I don't know. That's not really the history of Christianization, right? And of course, I'm not going to digress now on the Imperial Catholic tradition, but it's obvious that Milan was to become one of the most important episcopal centers in the West. To make it simple, we will see it better in the video about the early Middle Ages, telling the truth. But going back to the roots briefly, the Milanese diocese was probably established between the 2nd and the 3rd century. That early because it was a big center. That's where, Christian communities would first gather in 313. As you know, Constantine agreed with Licinius in the promulgation of the Edict of Milan, right, which thus brought the city to be the starting point of the granting of freedom of worship in the empire, not just to Christianity, and prescribing, however, in particular, the immediate return of confiscated property to Christians, to the Christians that had been previously persecuted just under Diocletian. I made a video about that one, I remember before. You can find all the stuff in the late antique playlist. But definitely the most important step, and I'm making it very simple as far as the religious side of the story goes, in Milanese history is the affirmation of the figure of Saint Ambrose, that was bishop of the city from 374 to 397. How to present him? He first of all fought against Arianism in a quite delicate political balance, where Emperor Theodosius, and I made a video about this, was trying to sort of keep the Gothic, in fact Arian federati calm in the Illyricum. And there was all an intransigence that was displayed by this early church in the figure of Ambrose. It was very firm and representing, by the way, to the fullest, like the spirit of transformation, because before becoming Bishop of Milan, he had been actually an imperial official, an administrator, and as such he also was able to effectively take the reign of the Milanese diocese, as it had become, as you understand, together with the importance of the city as a whole, one of the most important in the West. Ambrose was also very loyal to the properly Catholic unity of the empire. He had a great deference to the Roman Pope. There is an axis that starts forming in Western spirituality between Rome, Ravenna, the latter a bit later, but Milan already from this point, and Gaul. Right, Milan always remains a gateway to France that is very much also connected with Rome, much earlier than Charlemagne's times, right? When Charlemagne arrived in Rome, it was just reinforcing what the Merovingians had done since the foundation of the same. But this, the Christianization of the Franks, but the relations between Italy and Gaul, true. This is especially the latter, especially true for the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages as a starting point. We have this hinge of Milan, of the Pop Valley, right? That was a sort of also an ecclesiastical province on its own, at least in cultural terms, but maintain its own specificities and relevance and centrality. The figure of Ambrose, again, is immense. I made too few about him, but we are really... I'm curious, if you give him a second, how much I actually remembered one about Theodosius, but yes, Ambrose of Milan, Symmachus, and the Altar of Victory, that's quite instructive, but I was sure I did something else. Well, it doesn't matter. In any case, you'll find that there is also Ancient Christianity as a playlist where you can find it, and we don't talk about this that often because we make less Roman history, and this fits in fact into antiquity, but it's still all connected with the city of Milan. Like Ambrosian is a synonym to Milanese, right? So if you read also in books, and I don't know, the later signories, the Italian communal struggles, etc., Milan is repeated very often, so the writers use Ambrosian, and you know that it's the city of Saint Ambrose, right? Milan. It's naturally the patron of the city. Wu stood up again to imperial politics in the West. It's true that Milan became the most influential church, at least after Rome. At this point, and under Ambrose himself, arguably also the most important in the entire Western Roman Empire. From 313, immediately after, as we've seen, Constantine's Edict of Milan, which allowed Christianity among the practiced religions of the Roman Empire, the first Christian churches began to be built in Milan, because up to that point it had been illegal, right? Christians gathered at least in, say, more humble abodes. They, under the persecutions, of course, they could not have their churches, right? So this instead now began to flourish. And it's in this context that, by the way, in 386, the same St. Augustine of Hippo was converted to Christianity and baptized by Ambrose, right? And that's how important, as far as the fathers of the church's history, this really is, right? St. Augustine coming from a Manichaean background and finally realizing, under this great figure that is very firm, very strong, very, again, real, right? He's a realpolitik thinker in many ways, because he had been in the gangles of the imperial administration. He knew how to help the empire. This is the face of the church at this point. We're people with massive attributes and capable of handling this in a political sense, right? The establishment, for example, of a true Christian Roman Empire, in the sense of Christianity supporting fully the Roman imperial authority, something that starts from here. Also in terms of military thought, the idea of the defense of the empire as being legitimate for Christians. As far, but that was not the problem of shedding blood, because, as you know, the commandment is not about killing; it's about murdering. Right? You shall not murder, not killing. Killing was full of perfectly efficient and bloodthirsty Christian soldiers. Since ever, it had never been a problem for them to kill people in their job. The problem during the persecutions had only been not, sacrificing, being forced to sacrifice to an earthly authority that they didn't recognize as divine, because their divine standard was higher, at least was hoped to be so. So we'll come back, and I sure made a video about this, about Ambrose, but I can't find it. Oh, here, actually it is. Ambrose of Milan and the foundation of Christian Roman imperial conscience. Right? So if you think about these major changes in the history of mankind, starting, of course, from the pillars of Western civilization, taking place in this city, you understand the relevance, like how even for the Goths, the Longobards, how relevant it was, just for Carolingians, like for anyone, having a city with such prestigious history. When you think the migration here, and I see people that come to this channel watching just, well, what about, I must know about the Goths, I must know about the Alans, because it's so central and crucial. And maybe you realize they skip completely the fact that there was something like this, that alone, arguably, was even more important, of course, than these migrations. And you wonder, but how do they think that those same peoples lived, if they do not know, do not appreciate these topics? Like, there is a level of, not just of sheer ignorance, which we are all habituated to, unfortunately, but, the complete lack of, the existence of a focus that completely excludes by default the pillars of, any Western identity. And this is very, very serious, because even if you think that there is something here, that there are lots of people that do not look at Christianity favorably, also because they do not actually know much about it in the first place. But even if you, want to find a bridge between these other players that were Christians, by the way, as Arians, and eventually their entire history later, till to you, like, how can't you simply forget about Christianity and pretend that this is a word that you cannot study. But again, that's why I also make these videos, because I think that somebody must speak of that. Like, if historiography does, but pop culture doesn't, and so you must correct pop culture, because that's so miserable from just a cultural point of view, not just because of these reasons that you sort of give for granted that if you go to a university you study these things, yes, but what about all the others? Wouldn't the world be a better place if anybody knew this correctly, and how it really was? Well, never mind. By the way, Milan in 355 was the site of a council, actually of a schismatic nature, and convened by the Emperor Constantius II with the aim of condemning the Trinitarian doctrine in favor of Arianism. So when you look at also Ambrose and the affirmation of Catholicism, you understand that there is a strong victory, of course, of the Catholic tradition, and in fact, at the end of the council, Arianism was declared heresy. And so you understand that already in these centers, of course, nobody was being bowed by the foolish. There's an incredibly and strikingly undeniable character and similarity between Arianism and Protestantism. I'm not kidding about this. I explained this, I don't remember where, I think in the videos about the traditional meaning of the Renaissance, which actually makes you really think about the fall of universal authority, both at the end of antiquity and of the Middle Ages, albeit with different sort of circumstances. But there is a reason if eventually civilization survives in these areas and Arianism is rejected. In any case, going back a bit to the urban and topographic dimension, say the first early Christian basilicas in Milan that we know are the so-called double ones, right? And this particular structure derived likely from, at least this is an hypothesis, not confirmed, but by the one of the Roman Horea, right? At least it's an idea. Or even more likely, these churches were separated for the baptized and catechumens. It could be both things, telling the truth. We find the latter hypothesis comforted at Aquileia. Of course, you would find the double structure of the Horea already quite comfortable for that, so they could overlap. And the reason why the baptized and the catechumens were separated is that the sacrament of baptism at the time was only granted upon completion of a process of conversion and spiritual purification. So they cared much more. These were the ages of the Donatists, of, say, some still troubles in the definition of Catholic orthodoxy, and as such, you would have still certain standards that were upheld just to express a political statement within the church. We have the Basilica of Santa Tecla, the ruins of which can be visited under the Cathedral of Milan, that already had a traditional apse, but is reminiscent still those of the basilicas attached to large civil palaces, as they had started emerging at some point, first as just support from the Christians and then conversion within these great houses, and for eventually making the church instead a much more public place, and so not a private one of this or that protector. In fact, the latter phase corresponds to that of the great basilicas of the later Roman era, in fact, as the polygonal in shape cruciform. And they were models adopted, besides Milan, also by some of the most basilicas of the late Empire. Right, you see them in Rome and Constantinople. So you can argue that already from the late antique period, the religious center of Milan was located where the current cathedral square stands, the most famous spot in Milan. And at the time, it included two cathedrals, right? The Basilica Vetus, or Minor, known as the Winter Cathedral, and the Basilica Nova, or Major, known as the Summer one, right? And the reason why these do not exist anymore is that the Cathedral of Milan, so the current one, was, the structure, at least from which also later developed, was built in their place, right? Other early Christian basilicas built in Milan were there is a long list of these basilicas: the one of the Apostles, one of the Gospels, the one of the Martyrs. There was the Palatine Basilica, the one of the Gate, the one of the Prophets, the one of Saint Calimer, the one of the three Magi, the one of the Virgins. And these were all built, and they give you a dimension, in fact, of the massive amount of ecclesiastical structure present in Milan, all before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, what is fascinating about the later Milan, starting from the Middle Ages, but in fact from this late antiquity as we see now, in fact, is the prolific amount of any kind of church, monastery, that again stretch out. It's also in the Milanese hinterland. You can find an incredible number. This naturally is a product just of the importance of the city over the centuries. Also the medieval rebuilding was really, the further spread actually was really shocking, right? Again, the level of development of this area compared to Europe is unmatched. And but you see, since late antiquity in the city, how many buildings, how many structures, how many communities, and how important the church really was, right? This would remain a constant in Milanese history, where in spite of the wealth, say stand in the 12th century against the emperor, importance of the people, and so on, actually this city was always ruled in a very hierarchical way, right? There were the great lords, then the bishop of Milan, and the people as well, and the latter actually never took over, right? And the importance of the church was immense, right? We've seen it in different videos that, especially the ones about the Carolingian church, specific ones about Italy, that highlight how much these guys were the actual rulers of the land, not much feudal authority, right, before the commune state took over. It's something we will see it better, but it's still very relevant to point out. Now, of all the basilicas that we listed, for example, we know that some have been demolished just over the centuries, not necessarily destroyed in a terroristic fashion, but literally demolished because, like, leaving space to others. This basilica is being rebuilt, of course. In fact, many of them survived in practice, and changing name, being dedicated to a saint specifically. Aside from their originary generic functions, names, etc. Again, the history of the Milanese church brings to this better definition and organization as well. Naturally, given the, as we've seen, relevance within the empire, Milan also had imperial residences, palaces, for the imperial court, again, and also just the representative and administrative palaces for the officials, etc. And this quarter occupied essentially the part of the city between the circus and the forum. And as it was really normal at the time, the palaces had direct access to the circus. Hence what we were saying about the Longobards, like watching from the same palace of power, actually the same chariot races. There was a security reason to that, because the emperor could reach the circus in that way without having to go through the streets, which was definitely dangerous, especially when all those people went to watch the spectacles. Look at the Nika revolt in Constantinople. I made a video about that, right? Here things were a bit tidier, but admittedly Milan was also not Constantinople, but not that smaller actually, as we were pointing out before. There was a triumphal road in Mediolanum, known as the Via Porticata in Latin. The reason being obviously that it was lined with large colonnaded porticos, and this started from the Roman gate, continuing in fact towards Rome and ending in that direction at the large celebratory arch that was actually much bigger than the one that you see in the Roman Forum itself, the one of Constantine. All right, so Milan had really impressive ancient monuments. This do not exist anymore, unfortunately. There is an area outside the same within Milan, but outside the ancient city, that is known as Crocetta, and that's where in fact the ark stood. In 401, Venerius, that was a disciple and deacon of Saint Ambrose, became the bishop of Milan. He succeeded Simplicianus in this office, and this fit the problem we were talking about before about the Donatists, because the Council of Carthage that was held in the same year, in June, brought this request of new priests due to a local vocations crisis. Priests and deacons were sent from Milan to Africa, and this is also interesting because of the connection with Augustine, and so this early context and still, maintenance of standards aside from various provincial rebellions, heresies, and so on. And the important aspect of this is that among these priests sent to Carthage, there was Paulinus, who is a famous biographer of Saint Ambrose himself. Right, and the guy remained in contact with John Chrysostom, that the same Paulinus defended when the former was exiled, 404, given that he had dared essentially to condemn the imperial corruption in Constantinople. And so what is fascinating is how still, of course, very much interconnected at the beginning of the 5th century the empire really was, like between Milan, Carthage, Constantinople. This is also the same context of the Visigothic invasion of Italy. In fact, in the same 401, the King Alaric entered the peninsula, following across from the northeast, following the track of the Via Postumea without finding any resistance. This was essentially a Roman army. I mean, the Visigoths, even in the royal institution, were created in Illyricum as the local provincial army, right? And they had, at this point, tried to essentially gain their own autonomy. They had, again, entered 20 years before and settled in the empire after Adrianople, and at this point the Roman military was just already committed defending its northern borders from the Alans and the Vandals, to the point that the Julian Alps, in fact in the northeast, were left heavily ungarrisoned, and the Visigoths from Illyricum could pour in, right? So in winter 402, Alaric arrived with his army under the same walls of Milan that was besieged, right? This was quite a dramatic moment. Honorius, the current emperor of the West, decided to move the imperial court to Gaul. You see, his father Theodosius was the same guy again that had to cope with these issues with Ambrose. The division of the empire had been produced, but there was a rivalry, of course, between East and West, and the Visigoths were thrown at each other, right? And of course, Now Stilicho comes into play, as you know, and he basically plays with the gods like cat and mice. But still, this was again a pretty effective army. The gods had already been employed by the Romans abundantly, paying, by the way, a very high tribute of blood as imperial soldiers in different frontiers. And now they were exploiting the situation in the west at their advantage, right? And Honorius abandoned Milan because he believed the city was not defensible. But Stilicho, his Magister Militum, tried at least to convince him to stay. Honorius still fled the city and left there his commander. The emperor crossed the lake of Como in the north, asking for reinforcements in Rezia, in fact, in the north, across the Alps. And in March, the emperor decided that this is the moment in which properly Milan was ceased to be the western capital, and Ravenna was chosen because it was all surrounded by swamps, and it had also greater access to the east. And we'll talk about this phase of history. Ravenna is yet another city we should discuss. Not overwhelmingly important in the later Middle Ages, but still very in the early one, as you know, the See of the Exarchate, etc. But we're far from that still. So in practice, you have Milan having remained the capital of the Western Roman Empire for 116 years. So from 286 to this 402. The Milanese were not happy, of course, of Honorius' decision moving the capital to Ravenna, right? But still, the latter was still to be more defensible. In spite of this pessimism, Stilicho, through reinforcements, managed to break the Visigothic siege of Milan in a matter of few months, right, in early April. So the siege lasted a couple of months, and the fascinating aspect of this is that the same Stilicho had lots of gods in his own army, right? So this plays a bit as a paradox to those. At least we want to stress just the gods were univocally against the empire, or they weren't the actual allies and soldiers that they mostly were within this system now. But of course, as the Romans fought against each other, of course the gods would against the Romans and other gods, right? So Alaric moved further west, actually, but in the same April, he was pursued, attacked, and defeated at the Battle of Pollentia by Stilicho, right? And the gods suffered heavily in men, in supplies, and the same Alaric had his family captured. Many gods, also women and children, were held as hostages. These would be killed later. And in this sense, it's very graceful how Alaric handled Rome, because of the fear that still was sparked by the imperial authority, the sacred city, and the general subservience that the Gothic Federati at that point really still had, right? Just to even be able to find a place in the west where to settle without having inflicted too much pain to the same eternal city. But we're still in 403 when Alaric was again defeated by Stilicho at the Battle of Verona. He had moved east this time, and the thing went on into Illyricum as well, and this actually reflects how really capable of coping with the gods the Roman army really was. After 10 years after Adrianople, probably the Romans could feel the same amount of troops to fight actually the worst of Roman enemies, that is, another Roman force of the same size. So again, the crisis of Adrianople is something, a bit overstated. It is true that these gods were sort of a pain in the behind, but and they played it cleverly. At least they were desperate here, evidently, but still, it's not their power that was the tip of the balance in Roman history overall. Majoranus defeated them, and if it hadn't been for the Vandals standing in the way, they would have been deported somewhere else, as it happened, I don't know, to the Burgundians, for example, under Aetius. In any case, in 408, the Master of Offices, with the support of some imperial courtier, and the Milanese Christians, remember, were still pagans at this point, despite of, Theodosius having made the Christianity the official religion of the empire, at least the main one. He incited a revolt of the Roman army stationed close to Milan in Pavia in August, and this brought to the deaths of at least 7 officers loyal to Stilicho. So this was caused by all the reasons that, we mentioned the episode just because of this Milanese involvement, but what's the point? That Stilicho defeated repeatedly the gods that could have been crushed at every time after he didn't push. So since he was an Arian, and he had, of course, negotiations going on with Alaric all the time, he was accused of wanting to establish essentially what would have happened later, so a realm in Gaul with his son Eucharius as the leader. And from there, however, that this wouldn't happen, taking Constantinople. He was accused of having assassinated the prefect Rufinus, but this is not really so important. But the important thing, of course, is Honorius managing to put down this revolt and ordering his army stationed in Ravenna to capture Stilicho. That actually understood was nothing to do. He died a soldier. He accepted his fate. He bowed his head, and he was executed by Heraclian on August the 22nd. In a pretty different world from the one of, say, the Imperial fasts, but this was in fact becoming the sunset of the Western Empire, but not necessarily. That I believe that if it hadn't been again for Gaiseric, the Western Roman Empire would have lived on. There's really no doubt about this. In any case, at the beginning of the same year, Maros became the new bishop of Milan. He succeeded Venerius, and this guy was from Antioch. This was still normal at the time. You would have these guys from Syria. That was very florid area at the time, and bringing together with that the cult of the martyrs, which was in many ways stronger in the East, and particularly Babulus and Romanus. And this, in Milanese history, had a relevance, like in the spirituality, in the Christian identity of the city. Like this would become like part of why Milan is Milan with a divine bond with these martyrs figures and their veneration, right? And then here we start a bit, of course, into the darkest aspects. Let's arrive at least to the end of the western half of the Roman Empire to start next time, hopefully the early medieval part. I don't know where it stops. The latter will stop. We'll see. In any case, in 452, you have Attila's Huns arriving in Milan. Right, and this was also, again, the city was still pretty important. There was a siege, and Attila demanded at least the valuable possessions of the Milanese without destroying the city. So this was a compromise, not to bring the siege to the extreme. Also because the Huns had just a partial siege capacities. Actually, the Huns are heavily overrated in a military sense. but it was just a form of tribute, like you basically sacked the city by just, making the population paying a lot, but not taking over the city. So it was a compromise. Milan, of course, goes through all the various Italian events of the time. You have the early Odoacer, actually the Germanic war bands from all the most possible different groups, not just Germanic ones, but mostly at this point making up throughout the following decades the Western Roman army. What happens in 476? That is practically nothing, but still enough. The Imperial insignia of the West are brought to Constantinople by Odoacer's. By Odoacer that, in this sense, decided to do without the formality of an emperor that at this point had sort of depleted itself and making everything very simple. Of course, Milan had lots of things going on with different emperors, but we can't quite just digress on every single detail. Then the Goths arrived, the Ostrogoths, right? Visigoths having moved in Gaul, in Aquitaine, in Spain. And, what the deal was, the Ostrogothic kingdom was established in Italy on behalf of the Constantinopolitan emperor. And, okay, this opens really another chapter, so I would stop it here. But you know the story, talk about it. So I'm glad we talked about this, because I think it's very important to understand better the specificities of the city of Milan in the Middle Ages. And maybe from this video, if you've never gotten interested in the history of the city, it doesn't sort of emerge what kind of what meaning does this have, because I understand it. For most people, again, it's the idea that the word the Romans, then a flatland happened, to materialize in their stead, and then something called the Middle Ages happened. For cities like Milan, you can't really do that. Just like echoing in your ears, like Saint Babylos, for example. That's a typically Milanese thing. It's the spirituality, the urban identity, the municipal pride, the idea that there is a Roman aristocracy that maintains its sort of retinues that are at the basis actually of the same militias that you see in the Middle Ages later on. It's all something that survives in Gothic times, in Longobarд times. The Romanity, right? Milan maintains an incredibly powerful Roman meaning throughout all its history, and in the region, right? You see, Pavia was the Longobard capital, but Milan was sort of the Roman equivalent that would serve as a second capital for the same Longobards that would play the Germans in Pavia and the Romans in Milan. I'm simplifying, of course. They would play the Longobards and fundamentally the Italians in the entire concept. But aside from the very heavy mark, of course, that they left in the Western Po Valley as a state, right, and of course also in other parts of Italy. But in fact, the state thing is the Romanity of it, the public, central, civilized thing that in these centers is maintained. Pavia is the palace, of course, but Milan also maintains a great relevance. Monza does. And we have to talk about all the cities to understand exactly their relation, how it's much more unitary, actually, than it sounds, right? Because, again, multiple cities, one may think, but it's fragmented. It's weak, it's small, I don't care. Quite the opposite of this, right? And this will be clear again, hopefully, in the next chapters. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.